get started because I think we just have, we're so excited to have Ann Goldstein here. We have so much to cover today. And I want to welcome you all so warmly. It's just terrific to have you at this wonderful event. And I want to begin by thanking Simona. Simona, raise your hand so everybody knows who you are. There she is. Simona, who actually is responsible for spearheading the Interviste Italiane series. It was her fabulous idea to invite Ann Goldstein for today. And I'm so honored and pleased that you asked me to be hostess of this event. I feel tremendously emozionata. This is actually a first reunion for me and Ann, since we got to know each other 5 years ago under unusual circumstances. Mi spiego. She had presented her monumental 3-volume edition of Primo Levi's completed works in English to an enduring audience at Trinity College in Hartford. And she needed a ride to New Haven so she could catch the late train back to Manhattan. Well, it just so happened that my husband, Alan, and I, we just happened to be driving back to New Haven. And so we got the great luxury of being able to spend a delightful hour and some in her company. I think we should all be on mute. I think we might be getting a little bit of interference. Okay, I hate to mute you all, and there will be a time when we will unmute everyone. So, we go back to this time, and this was a time way before COVID, but another kind of epidemic, a literary one, had already gripped the country, Ferrante fever. And it's this that brought Ann to her much deserved public attention for a practice of an art best known for its invisibility, that wonderful kind of paradox. For us in Italian studies, Ann's importance goes beyond her renown for translating the Neapolitan Quartet. And so this afternoon, we're going to be focusing on Ann's broad engagement with Italian literature, in addition, of course, to delving into the Ferrante phenomenon. So a few words today about our format. Ann has graciously agreed to spend an hour and a half with us. So I'm hoping we have plenty of time to do all that we want to do in her presence. And I'll be starting by giving you a brief overview of her career to date and asking some questions along the way. Then I'll turn it over to 3 of our graduate students, Sarah Atkinson. Raise your hand, Sarah. There she is. And Giovanni Milianti from Pisa, and Costanza Barchesi, newly back to New Haven. We welcome her back warmly. And then we'll open it up to audience questions, and that will be the point where I will ask you all to unmute. So Ann Goldstein was born in Maplewood, New Jersey. She spent her undergraduate years at Bennington, majoring in ancient Greek, and then moving on to the University College of London, where she received a master's in comparative philology. So we see right away that languages were at the forefront.
I know, I did not get a master's, however.
Oh, you didn't? Oh, thank you for letting me know. But yeah. Anyway, she was there, and she did study comparative philology. Yes, and do interrupt if I misrepresent things. Anyway, please.
No, that's absolutely okay.
No, I insist. So she entered the work world as a copy editor for Esquire, before embarking on a 30-year stint as a copy editor at The New Yorker, and rose to the level then of head of that very important department. And I must say, in reading about her descriptions of the way in which copy work is done in The New Yorker, I was just absolutely, my mind was boggled. I could never have imagined that the process would be as meticulous as you described it, with reading and rereading by multiple editors before a piece was deemed perfect and therefore worthy of going into print. And here we understand what a great training that was for the pignolerie required by translation itself. During her time at the New Yorker, Anne's translating was limited to nights and weekends. And even so, she produced a body of work which would put full-time career translators to shame. And just to give you an idea of the vastness of her output, let me just read you the names of the authors she's translated. And I'm going to do so divided into gender, and you're going to see why in a minute. So here goes. And please jump in if I've left anybody out.
I probably don't even know if you've left anybody.
Okay, so here goes. Alessandro Baricco, Giancarlo De Cataldo, Giacomo Leopardi, Primo Levi, Pierpaolo Pasolini, Aldo Buzzi, Elena Ferrante, senz'altro, Elsa Morante, Amara Lacus, Pia Pera, Jhumpa Lahiri, Elena Janesek, Serena Vitale, Piera Sonino, Rita Charbonnier, and Anna Maria Ortese, to name a few. And I'm sure I've left some out. And Anne, if others come to mind, please let me know. So with this overview in mind, I'd like to ask Sarah to pose her first question to Anne.
Right. So I wanted to start by saying thank you so much for bringing all of this rich literature that I love in Italian into English, because it has brought my vocation as an Italian scholar that seems very distant and remote to many of my friends and family who don't speak Italian. It has brought it much closer and made it much more accessible to them. So I really appreciate the clarity of your translations and the faithfulness to the originals. So I would love to hear, first of all, it's a big picture question about your translation. How do you select your projects? And do you have any dream texts that you would love to work on one day?
Well, I mean, I've actually been incredibly lucky. Most of my projects have come to me from editors, basically. And I've really also been very lucky in that most of them have been amazing writers. So I'm kind of left with no dream texts in a funny way. I mean, I've translated, I mean, I always had wanted to translate. Well, after the second book I translated was kind of a crazy situation, but I translated Petrolio, which very few people have read in English or Italian. But it really made me kind of fall in love with Pasolini. So I did always want to translate more Pasolini, and I was, and I got to do that. So, or even someone like Leopardi, that was also kind of a dream job. But so I've just been lucky that I've been able to translate these writers that, would be dream writers to translate.
Maybe that's then a follow-up question for all of us. Do you take suggestions?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm sure other dreams will come your way in terms of requests and projects. Yeah. So I'd like to follow up on that by asking you your thoughts about the fact that over half of the authors whom you've translated are women. And is this just by chance? Is this inadvertent, or do you have an affinity for women's writing?
Well, I think it's what's interesting is when, you sort of, you mentioned this, and I hadn't really thought of it, but in the beginning, when I first started translating, I translated a lot more men. I translated almost no women. And recently I've translated a lot of women. And I think it's, it's partly this kind of Ferrante effect, which is that more women are being translated. So there's more of an opportunity. I think, I probably do feel a greater affinity for women. But again, it's been, lucky that I've been asked to do a lot of women writers. So it's both so I think it's, it does have something to do with Ferrante's success, I think.
Yes. So the Ferrante fever, the good side of it is the Ferrante effect.
Yeah, and I
Yeah.
think that, yeah, I mean, people are more interested in Italian women writers, and publishers are more willing to publish Italian women writers. In fact, I think it's probably true in Italy too. I mean, I always hesitate to make any generalizations about Italy because I don't really know, but I think that Ferrante has given other women more of a chance to be read, to be heard.
Yeah. Yeah. So a wonderful epidemic then.
Yeah.
Very positive and very constructive. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. I'd like to carry on with asking you what is, I think, of utmost importance to us here in Italian at Yale, which is why you came to embrace Italian, the language and the literature then, as your language and literature of choice as a translator. And I'd love it if you could tell us all how you were influenced by the way in which you came into Italian literacy, how you were influenced by the collective experience of learning Italian with your New Yorker colleagues, and with the Commedia as your portal,
I
and
know.
with Dante Pilgrim as your Virgil.
Well, I mean, it was kind of an unusual way of learning Italian. In that the reason, I mean, I sort of fell in love with Italian at some point. I don't know, maybe even years earlier. But I had read Dante in college, and I wanted to read it and I read it in a parallel text. I didn't know Italian, so I'd always wanted to read it in Italian. I just kind of, I don't know why you fall in love with these things, but I just fell in love with this language that I didn't even know yet. Well, I fell in love with the writer. I mean, I think that Dante, you know, when you're, I mean, you know, I was in my 20s, my early 20s, I read the Commedia as a kind of person who was searching for meaning of life or something like that. And it was very appealing to me. And the language also was very, you know, I just did love the language. And so when we had this group at the New Yorker and we studied grammar for a year, and then we read the Commedia for, I guess, probably 3 years. We actually read it all. But it was kind of an odd way to learn Italian because I feel that, I mean, that I have all kinds of gaps in my knowledge, not just in my grammatical knowledge. I feel like I'm constantly learning new things, and also in my literary knowledge, obviously, because I didn't study in an organized way. And, you know, I sort of am here and there making up for it. I mean, I was always reading, I always read other things, but it was very random. So I feel that I have these gaps, and I think that it's what makes me in some ways kind of a very stick to the text translator, because I'm always worried about getting, you know, I'm worried about getting something wrong, or I'm worried about moving too far from the text, or so I think that all those things come together. And then, as Penny mentioned, you know, there's the copy editing angle, which also, you know, adds to that kind of wish to have everything be exact or something.
Yeah. Yes, wonderful. Thank you so much for that. Now I'd like to turn this over to Giovanni Medianti, and he's going to ask some questions about Primo Levi, which is the focus of his dissertation now. I think you know, because I think you've met and had discussions, the two of you. And specifically the works of Primo Levi, the complete works, this monumental project that you undertook. And I might add, it was funded by the Guggenheim Foundation. And so Giovanni, where are you?
I'm here.
There you are.
Yeah, and you may or may not remember our meeting because it was very brief in the pre-pandemic world in Turin for the conference where you presented the Lezione Primo Levi 2 years ago now.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
But yeah, the work I would like to ask you about, and I'm gonna show it just to, you know, get a sense to our audience about the la mole, the extent of the work,
it was,
and also the impression it makes on, you know, on your guests when they come over to your house and they have Primo Levi's eyes looking at you.
I know.
But it's an impressive work, a translation project that covers 13 of Levi's published books and involves 10 translators, including yourself and Michael Moore, who I see
Yes,
the
Michael.
audience as well.
Where is he?
And I would like to ask you, how did you coordinate this translation project, and what were the challenges, if any, in terms of overall coherence?
Not a single challenge.
Yeah, I can imagine. So
No,
could you tell us a bit more about this?
Well, originally, the idea was the idea of an editor at Norton, Robert Weil. He had done the same thing with Isaac Babel, which is a whole other smaller idea. But the original idea was just to collect the original translations. Most of Levy had been translated, although not all, and to just put them all together in one big volume. But it soon became pretty clear that that would be, you know, it wouldn't really be worth it, because the translations were very different in style. They'd been done at different times. Especially the collections of stories were not published in English as they had been in Italian. So there were many of them that hadn't even been translated at all. So, you know, it just seemed like if you're going to do this project, it made sense to retranslate everything with not with one translator, but with one editor, certainly, one supervising voice, let's say, and to put the books together the way they had been published in Italy. So things like Altrui Mestieri, I mean, which was sort of a hybrid volume in English, but or the book is called The Mirror Maker in English, there was no Mirror Maker in Italian. Anyway, so that was the first challenge, was to decide to retranslate things. The only book we weren't able to retranslate was Se questo è un uomo. They couldn't get permission to do that, but Stuart Wolfe, the original translator, it turned out, had always wanted to correct his translation, or to revise it, and so he was able to do that, and that worked out. But the challenge, of course, it's a challenge to have however many different translators. I already forgot, 9 or 10. But I think the fact that I was the person who both edited and, you know, checked all the translations, I think that helped to make it seem like a, not necessarily as if it had been translated just by one person, but at least to have a kind of consistency of tone and style. And also, you know, I keep coming back to this, as a copy editor, I of course wanted to have consistent punctuation and things like that. And also I had a very good copy editor working with me. But so yeah, I mean, there were a lot of challenges, and like of that sort, but that's how it sort of worked.
How did you pick the 3 works that you translated? The Truth, former known to the American public as The Reawakening, the Periodic Table, and The Little and Other Stories.
How did
you pick the 3 books that you actually translated yourself?
I'd always wanted to do some stories, so I chose Lili. Then the Periodic Table went through 2 other translators who weren't able to do it, and I just thought, well, why not? You know, this is a great work. And The Truth I also had always wanted to do. So it was really, I just took what I wanted, basically.
Yeah, well, we were lucky with that. And just a question that is somehow personal. I'm working on the notion of pudore for my PhD dissertation, and got me thinking about words or expressions that are hard to translate literally into English, or that don't really have a one-to-one correspondent into English.
Yeah, well, like pudore, you mean?
Like pudore, for example, which, you know, is rendered in your translations as shame or embarrassment or modesty according to the place and the context. And I was wondering if you have any comments about such words or expressions peculiar to Levy that were particularly challenging to render into English.
Well, I mean, a word like that, you know, I went to a talk by, I think, a French translator who said that she had some word, I can't even remember what the word was. She had translated that word in the same way through wherever it appeared in this novel, which seemed pretty restrictive. I mean, I think you can't really do that, because words have such, you know, a word doesn't have the same, as you say, the word doesn't have the same connotations in both languages. And each context could possibly have a, you know, it's going to have a different nuance or a different connotation. So you sort of have to allow yourself to be a little freer in terms of translating a word. I mean, I have a long example that I could give you. of a word, of one word.
Please do.
Oh, well, some of you might have already heard it, but this word scomposti, which appears in very early on in the truce, in the phrase cadaveri scomposti. It's the Russian soldiers have just arrived at the camp, and they're looking at these few people. Well, the sentence in English is, when the Russian soldiers reached the fences, they paused to look, and with a brief, timid exchange of words, turned their gazes, checked by a strange embarrassment, to the cadaveri scomposti, to the ruined barracks, and to us few living beings. So the verb that it derives from, scompore, means to take apart, to throw into disorder, to disarrange. Scomposto means disorder, but also unseemly. So the problem, as I was saying, is to decide what meaning is stronger in this particular passage and which should prevail. So you decide, you choose, you exclude. In English, the dictionaries offered various possibilities. The cognate would be discomposed or something like that. Discomposed, an adjective that's usually used of a person who's not in order. And my first idea actually was physical, though in a slightly different sense. I thought of the scomposti as sort of decomposing corpses. And then I realized it was winter, so they probably wouldn't be decomposing. So these kind of elements. But then when I thought about the scene, I imagined this pile of corpses jumbled together. And we know that there's a common grave overflowing with bodies. So here I consulted with Domenico Scarpa, an Italian Levi scholar who was helping us with the complete works. And he said, well, scomposto means disordinato, in this case, like a pile of bones and limbs thrown haphazardly on the ground. But it also has this idea of obscenity. So there's this other implication. So a few lines earlier in this passage, we've read about this common grave into which Levi and his companion have dumped another body, one of their companion who's died. And they don't dump it actually in the grave, they dump it on top of the grave, on top of this pile. So Levi says, the grave, we dumped him not onto the grave, but onto the dirty snow, because the grave was full and no other burial could be given. That was Levi. But the fact that no burial could be given is already kind of obscene. So here, so, I'm sorry?
Ai reticolati.
If you could please unmute your microphones so we don't have any interferences.
Oh, anyway, I returned again to the sentence and to the scene. And I reflected on the whole thing. And I began to think that unseemly carried too much emotion, too much moral judgment, that the idea of the bodies in disorder was stronger. And besides, the idea of obscenity or the moral judgment is already contained in the gazes of the soldiers. So in the end, the phrase became jumbled corpses. Oh, I'm sorry, that was kind of a long explanation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for this. And I put the Italian original in the chat, so I hope people were able to follow your explanation. Thank you so much for this.
So anyway,
any further projects of translating Levi's interviews, perhaps?
I don't know. I don't know of any projects of that. I don't know. There should be.
Hopefully.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I just recently thinking about Levi, I suddenly thought, Levi, you could translate all of Levi all over again and not be, you would always find something new and of interest. So that
leads me to a follow-up. I had asked you if you would ever consider translating poetry.
No, I think poetry is just too hard. I think there's too much going on in poetry, and I don't know. It just doesn't appeal. I don't know if it doesn't appeal to me, but it just seems too hard.
Even Levi's poetry?
I don't know. It's true. Levi's poetry is particular, and it would probably be possible for a kind of a drudgy kind of person. I mean, a literal-minded kind of person like me would be possible. But
well, I think given the closeness with which you've worked with Levi's prose and they are so, the poetry is such an outgrowth, although in
Yeah.
a much more, as he says, emotional key. But anyway, I would love to see you do it, but that's me. That's me.
Never know.
Yes. Wonderful. Giovanni, have you finished with your follow-ups?
Well, I could ask many more, but I think there's more questions coming up.
Maybe when we open it up at the end. So at this point, I'd like to ask Sarah if she would come back to the podium or microphone and talk about Pasolini and Anna Maria Ortese.
Thank you. Yeah, so you mentioned that you started with Petrolio. I also started my graduate school career with a paper on the gardens in Petrolio.
Oh, really?
It was a disaster. It was overly ambitious. But now I'm working on Pasolini and cinema poetry and Ragazzi di Vita. And so I was delighted to find your translation, which I'm very interested in the title and also in the ways in which you handled the linguistic diversity of the text, because I know you've commented on this in Ferrante, there's this absence of dialect, even though she's marking where the dialect is happening in the story. But Pasolini writes the dialect into the text itself.
Exactly.
How does that pose a very specific challenge coming into English, where we have dialects, but they occur differently in English than in Italian?
Yeah, well, we don't really have dialects. That's the problem. I mean, we have accents, we have regionalisms, or regional speak, I guess. But and also, it seems to me that usually, if you try to put something into an accent, let's say if the Pasolini, if the Romanesco had been translated into, like Brooklyn slang, it would sound ridiculous. So there really is no good. I don't think there's any. Well, maybe you'll find some better way of doing it. I mean, I just try to emphasize, to make the dialect more slangy, more colloquial, and try to make a real differentiation between that and the more poetic parts. I mean, the sort of, the other part, the more natural, or not natural, but the whatever you would call it, the other tone. And just to be aware of that. I mean, it's pretty clear, I guess, in the Italian, it's clear. So I just tried to make a distinction as much as I could, without it being unreadable, without the slang being unreadable or sounding too weird.
There are lots of insults. Did you think about the kinds of insults that were current? This is something that Michael Moore talked about when he came to visit a few years ago, and talked about keeping current with the language and knowing what slang will be dated and what slang marks certain times. I'm so behind with slang. I probably use the slang that I know. I don't try to use the slang, obviously, of the time, of the 50s and 60s. There is, as I'm sure you know, there's an earlier translation from 1968, which, speaking of titles, is called the Ragazzi, which seemed crazy. I mean, nobody would know what that meant, right? I'm so glad you brought that up. I wondered if you went through other ideas for titles, so you landed on the Street Kids. I didn't actually
do the title. The editors I think they had basically already decided on it.
You're going to translate the Street Kids.
Right. Yeah, kind of. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it seemed to me that it worked pretty well, and that there was, there's no way to, obviously, Ragazzi di Vita is not translatable. I mean, literally. So, and I'm not a great titler, so I just went along with it.
That is a segue then into the next question I have for you, which is about the Neapolitan Chronicles in English, which followed Ferrante's tetralogy, but the original in Italian is Il mare non va a Napoli. Right. It's seen it as The Sea Doesn't Reach Naples.
Well, that again, I mean, that was sort of, we thought about that, and that was, it seemed like that would be kind of meaningless to an English-speaking audience. In addition, it turned out, which you probably know this, that was actually a title that was given to the book by Calvino and Vittorini, because who were the editors, and that actually Ortese was thinking of something more along the lines of Neapolitan Chronicles. So that sort of, which is also more descriptive of what the book is. I mean, Il mare non bagna Napoli, I mean, it's very poetic, but, you know, really, what does it mean? I mean, you know, what, it doesn't really, well, it does. I mean, you have to think about it too hard as a title, I think. So we decided to go with Neapolitan Chronicles.
How cool, as a way of sort of uncovering or recovering.
Yeah, yeah, that was also, yeah.
Very cool. And that was the collaborative translation, right? With Jenny McPhee.
Yeah, with Jenny McPhee, yeah. Which was,
like,
that was also, that was actually a great experience because translation is very solitary, as you know, and you're constantly racking your brains and, you know, as I said, you're trying to choose the right word, or you're trying to exclude this, exclude that. Is it this nuance? Is it that connotation? what's the right way to do this? If you have another person who can like make the decision for you, it's very comforting. But we split the stories originally, and so it was easy, you know, to sort of start out that way, and then we just passed them back and forth. And I think by the end we didn't even remember who had done the first version of each story, and we were also pretty well matched because I am, as I said, you know, I sort of am very close to the text kind of translator, and she's a novelist, so she's much more she's much freer. So we sort of had a good good relationship in that way.
Thank you so much. Penny, we can go back to you.
Okay, thank you both. And now we're going to move into the Neapolitan Quartet and the line life of the adults, into the Ferrante part of our session, and dig deeply. And so Costanza's done a lot of work on Ferrante. I'd like her to take it away.
Thank you so much, Penny. And I'm also joining everyone in saying how emozionata I am to have you here today with us. Thank you so much for accepting, although, you know, online, but it's fine. So yeah, it's what we have, right?
Right.
So yeah, my first question is more of a general question, I guess, on translating Ferrante. How did it feel in general? Because your translation has been regarded as seamless. It almost seems to flow naturally from Ferrante's Italian as a linguistic continuation of the original. So what were also the hardest spots of the text? Because I know, for instance, that there are words in Ferrante like smarginatura and frantumaglia that are very much important for her poetics, but are also very hard to render in English. And so I know that, for example, you've translated dissolving boundaries for smarginatura, which I think is a very good rendition. But did you have other ideas for this concept? And also, what about frantumaglia?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's sort of a weird thing. I was reminded, speaking of frantumaglia, that she uses the word in The Lost Daughter, which I had totally forgotten. But it's in dialogue, and it's just the narrator says, my mother had, well, she says it the way Ferrante says it in the book Frantumaglia, in the essay Frantumaglia. My mother had a word, frantumaglia, but you can't start talking about frantumaglia in all the great detail that she later talks about it in the book Frantumaglia. First of all, because she hadn't written it yet, or at least I hadn't read it yet. I had only this one word, which I knew was related to frantumare, which comes up in the next sentence. So I ended up saying, just translating it as shattering. But later, when it came up in frantumaglia, I was able, and there's a whole paragraph about the meaning of frantumaglia. And besides, the name of the book was Frantumaglia. So I left it in Italian. I was able to leave it in Italian and then just, you know, go on with this long definition. But this is all just to say that you don't always know what you have. And the same thing was true of smarginatura, where she uses it in the first book in My Brilliant Friend. And she just uses it really in that one place. You don't know, because she hadn't written the other books yet. I didn't know it was going to come back. So it was kind of come back in fact, in a much more elaborated form.
Mhm.
So, you know, you have what you have at the moment.
Yeah, of course. And
Anyway, but
would you?
smarginatura, well, as you know, I mean, it's an odd word. It's not, I guess.
I know, yeah,
you know,
yeah, totally. And would you say that these are kind of like untranslatables to a certain extent?
Yeah, I mean, frantumalia definitely is not. It's given all the meaning that she gives to it, and the meaning that eventually, you know, you can see that it has a much more symbolic, metaphoric meaning throughout her work. Yeah, I mean, then the more you think about it, the more untranslatable it seems.
Yeah.
And similarly with smarginatura, it's a similar kind of, you know, it becomes not just a word, but a concept, and a metaphor and a symbol, and it becomes all these other things that, you know, that as the translator, I wasn't really thinking about. I mean, first of all, because I didn't know how much wasn't studying the work in the same way that you know, that you guys are looking at it and studying it. But you just have what you know, as I said, you just have to think about the word as a word. I mean, I know with both of those words, I spent a long time trying to think about, you know, where they came from, what they meant, what they could mean. So, and then I just had in the end to choose a word. Although in the case of smarginatura, I had to choose two words.
Yes, sure. Makes total sense, yeah.
So,
and Penny, did you want to say something?
About smarginatura and this, and in your work as a copy editor, to me, the word also is very self-reflexive about writing and printing.
yes.
And that being outside the margins is a way of
Yeah.
talking about a kind of literature that is not within any kind of canon of Italian literature per se.
I hadn't thought of that. Yeah. No, interesting. Yeah, but there are definitely the margin. Yeah.
Yeah, my second question is about the title itself, because as you know, the original Italian is L'Amica Geniale, and it comprises of the quartet. While, of course, you had to translate with Neapolitan Quartet, and then the first book is My Brilliant Friend. So, first of all, I have to say I have a vested interest in this because I wrote an article on the implications of the geniale coming from the Latin genialis and from the concept of genius.
Yeah.
So, of course, I understand why you had to change it to brilliant, because genius wouldn't be the same in English. But I also wanted to ask if you had any other ideas for the translation, and also why did you include the possessive, like my brilliant friend?
Well, yes, I mean, we went through a lot of different things with brilliant, you know, with genius and all those words. And as you say, genius doesn't work so well in English. It's a much too limited a word, actually. You know, it doesn't have all those other connotations. And then as for why the possessive, well, I think Italian, you know, doesn't use a possessive often where English does. And to say the genius friend or the brilliant friend, it's kind of distancing in a way that that L'Amica Geniale isn't in Italian, or at least didn't seem to me that it was. And so it just seemed much more natural and sounded better, in addition to use the possessive in English.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. In fact, I think that it really captures the relationship, which is very much reciprocal between the two.
Exactly.
Gila and Elena, yeah.
Yeah, right, exactly. It brings them together in a way that the probably wouldn't.
Yeah, because one is the brilliant friend of the other one. So
yeah, exactly.
This way you really captured that, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so my third question is about, well, it's not really about Ferrante's identity, although I'm touching on it. So as you know, of course, Ferrante's identity has never been confirmed by the author herself, but it seems clear at this point that we are dealing with a translator. Have you ever noticed while you were translating that you were working on, you know, a fellow translator's work in general?
Not really. I mean, the only place where she really is where it seems almost specific in terms of translation is the issue of dialect. I mean, where she's in a sense translating the dialect all the time. I mean, and even that's not really explicit. I mean, but it's there. But I don't know. I mean, people have been have brought up this idea of her as a trans, which she may well be, and some people have made that case. But I don't know. I don't see it as part of the author.
Okay. But I think, for instance, yeah, but for instance, if you think even of the relationship between Lila and Lenou, one is always translating the other,
Yes. Yeah.
So,
but in a way, you could say that every author is translating, what's in her mind into what's on the page. Or, although, as you say, the fact that there are the two women, the two girls, translating each other all the time. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, in fact, I know that there's an article, I think Rebecca Falco from NYU says that, there's an inspiration from Krista Wolf's novel, The Quest for Krista T. Yeah. Yeah. So I don't know if you also maybe thought about this idea. And in general, what I've also read is that Ferrante's language seems to be in a sort of pre-translatable language, which means that it's the language is kind of ready, it's prone to be translating in a way. And I don't know if you've ever felt that way, especially comparing her to other people's work, like Mortese, for example, who's very different.
No, I don't think, I mean, I don't know if, to me, all translating is, I mean, every author has his or her own difficulties, and Ferrante does too. I mean, she writes those very long sentences that are run-on sentences in English that need to be controlled in some way or somehow put into English so that it doesn't sound not like English. So, that's one example. I don't know, the words are always, each word is always difficult. Not every word. So I don't know what that really means, that she's ready for translation in a funny way. Mm-hmm. I never felt that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, Penny, do you want to?
Thank you. Yes, thank you so much, Costanza. So, Anne, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the reasons of the spectacular success of the Neapolitan Quartet, especially in the English-speaking world, and especially among women, obviously, and as opposed to the more subdued reception of the quartet in Italy.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, many people have speculated on the popularity of the Neapolitan Quartet in English, and nobody seems to have a really good answer. But, I mean, I think in a sort of, on the most superficial level, it appealed both in a universal and a specific way to people. I mean, I remember an early review by, I think in the LRB, anyway, this woman talked about how getting together with her friends to discuss the Neapolitan Quartet and how they began, once they started talking, they became confused about what was their own lives and what was the life of the characters of Elena and Lila. And I think that somehow expressed the feeling that a lot of women had about these books, is that even though they didn't grow up in Rione of Naples, they could identify or sympathize or find some points of identification, I guess you'd have to say, with the characters, with everything that they went through, that they go through, even if it's not specifically the same. I mean, we all have relationships with our parents, our children, our spouses, our whatever, our friends, and that's what Ferrante really gets to the truth of. And she gets to some truths about these things. And she also, she goes beyond it. She takes you like past a place that's comfortable, that you might think is comfortable, in examining these things that you sort of are on the edge of your mind as well, particularly as a woman. But I think lots of men have read them too and have found them interesting. I remember somebody saying, someone in some gathering saying something like, suddenly I understood my mother.
Yes.
But anyway, so I think that's one of the things that that made them so popular.
Well, yes, I totally agree. And I think that, you mentioned women getting together and talking about the text, and then the blurring of the boundaries between their lives and these characters.
Mm-hmm.
Part of it, I think, has to do with the book club phenomenon.
Oh, yeah.
Don't you think?
I think that's true. Yeah.
And more popular as a phenomenon. And both, as Sarah told me, she has a friend who's British, who also said that, the book clubs are also a phenomenon in the UK.
Yeah.
And I just remember in recent years, when people meeting women who asked me what I did, and I would tell them that I was on an Italian faculty, and they would say, "Oh, Italian, you must have read Elena Ferrante. We've read it in our book clubs." And time and again,
Mm-hmm.
I've gotten that kind of response. So I think that that's a very important, almost institutional.
Yeah.
Basis of
true.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. What do you think about the idea that the Italian literary establishment was less enthusiastic than American audiences and critics have been? What do you make of that?
Well, I mean, I think that Italy, excuse me for saying this, is still kind of pretty much a patriarchal culture. I mean, people, and I'm not just saying this, I mean, this is what I've heard people say. I mean, other scholars, especially the scholars, there are now women scholars, women Italian scholars who talk about this and saying that, I mean, I remember going to Naples with Tiziana de Rogatis, who is the main Ferrante scholar, Italian scholar, with her and several others, there was a Ferrante conference at the university there, which was like a huge thing, that it was accepted that there could be an academic conference on Ferrante.
Wow.
So that was really, so I think, but nevertheless, they were talking about this just recently, she's still not really accepted as an academic subject or, in the canon. So I think that's obviously still something of a problem. On the other hand, as I was saying earlier, there is, I think, a little bit of a Ferrante effect in that more women are being published.
Yeah, well, thank you about mentioning the fact that she's not canonical. And I was thinking about, I think the way that Italian critics and scholars privilege actual style, il bello stile che m'ha fatto onore, as Dante says to Virgil, that her style was seen as dismissed as lacking polish, and that it's functional and utilitarian. And I think that Italians are willing to dismiss literary worth out of hand if they think that the prose surface itself is lacking, and a kind of unwillingness then to dig deeper into the notion that it might be content and substance, which is the strength of a certain writer.
Well, she also, I mean, Ferrante talks about how she doesn't want to write this bello stile. She doesn't believe in beautiful writing. And if her writing gets too beautiful, she tears it up and goes back to her original draft.
Oh my God.
Yeah, so she's kind of challenging that, I guess, in a, pretty openly, you could say.
Oh, that's great to know. So it's her smaginatura, getting outside the margins.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah. Thank you. That's most helpful. So I wanted to be very personal about my own relationship to the quartet, which is that I've responded to the sheer length of the reading experience. I'm a very slow reader, and I live the text, particularly this text, for almost a year of my life. And I wondered, and it made for a very, very intense personal relationship to it. And by the way, I grew up with a brilliant friend, and my brilliant friend is still my brilliant friend. But in any case, this unusual experience I had because of length. And I wondered if you felt that prolonged engagement, just in temporal terms, had any kind of impact on your translation?
I mean, I think it must have. I mean, I spent 4 years with these books, but it's sort of, I only realized recently that I'd never read them all through. I mean, one after the other, because as I was working on them, the one ahead wasn't done yet. So I worked on one, and that was finished, and then I worked on the second one, and the third one, and the fourth one. I mean, there was usually kind of a hiatus of a few months maybe during the year. But I remember when I finished working on the third one, I think, I mean, I handed in the manuscript or something, and I had a little break before the galleys or whatever. And I thought, I felt that my life was empty. And then I realized it was because those characters were not in my mind anymore. I mean, they weren't, filling my mind. I wasn't living their life with them. Wow. So I do think that it had a real kind of impact, in that way, those characters sort of became my life. I also, and because of the timing of the way they were written and the way the deadlines for the translations, I ended up doing the second ones, no, the second, third, and fourth, I think. I sort of translated them in real time. I mean, my first draft, I was reading and translating at the same time. So I think that also, gave a kind of urgency or something to the text, to the translation process.
Absolutely. I think we feel that your personal urgency and immersion in the text and the characters fueled, the translation. Well, that's very, very interesting. I remember when I finished, I went into withdrawal. I called it Ferrante withdrawal. And I remember wandering through the house, trying to find a book to read that could fill that void.
Right. What do you read? I mean,
what do you read? Yes.
I don't know. Dickens.
Yes. Or maybe you wait for The Lying Life of Adults.
Yeah, right.
Which we're going to talk about in just a minute. So I wanted to, I wanted to ask you about her relationship to dialect, but I think that we've already gone into that, and your own thoughts about that, particularly with Pasolini and Ragazzi di Vita. So I'd like to move on then to The Lying Life of Adults. And by the way, I want to recommend it to all of you, particularly those of you who went through a kind of withdrawal after finishing the quartet. And so the question is, in the light of the quartet's Fortuna, the stakes for the next novel were undoubtedly quite high. What was your experience then of translating The Lying Life of Adults after having played the leading role in bringing Ferrante's masterwork to the attention of the English-speaking world?
Well, I mean, obviously, there's a lot of pressure. But I think that the pressure of the translation was merged with the pressure of, would people like the book? Because it really, it is kind of different from the Neapolitan novels. I mean, it's quite different in a way. I mean, certain things are the same. I mean, obviously there are many similar themes having to do with women, with friendship, with women and their bodies, women and sex, women and their mothers. Not so much women and their fathers. That's much more of a theme in this book. But then there's the whole thing of it being told through the mind of a teenager, which is the biggest difference. I mean, you don't really know who's writing the story, but certainly you're very much in the mind of the teenager, of Giovanna, even if it's an older version of her, or people have suggested that it's not even necessarily Giovanna who's writing this story. I don't know. Anyway, I think there was a lot of pressure on, whether it would be seen as, I mean, I guess it's true for any writer of, after your big success, what's coming next? It's going to be more closely examined, and, whatever, torn apart, examined. So yes, I think there was a lot of pressure.
Yeah. Did you feel any pressure then in translating it, that kind of pressure?
Yeah, I did, because I thought, it's also possible that the translation will be examined too. will be criticized and you know, looked at in a different. I mean, as it turned out, it wasn't really. I mean, people were more concerned with the book. And then I thought about Ferrante. I thought, well, you know, she's probably just as anxious as as I am. And then I thought, well, actually, she probably isn't, because she does seem to have a detachment from her work once it's published. I mean, this is another thing that she said is, you know, well, I wrote the book, isn't that enough? So she doesn't engage with anything after that. And she's also said, well, you know, I don't have to publish. I can publish or not publish. So she decides to publish, then she's, you know, she's published and that's it. Anyway, I did, all those things were sort of part of my mind, in my mind when I was working on it.
So did this new book pose any kinds of translational issues for you? And were there continuities and discontinuities between the prose styles of the quartet and the latest novel, apart from the difference in the narrators themselves? And did your translation seek to bring out the continuities or the discontinuities with the earlier works?
I didn't, you know, to me, it seemed pretty, the continuities seemed greater than the discontinuities. I mean, the point of view was the real difference. But I think that the sentences, by sentence, there was a lot of similarity. I mean, I think there's that same kind of, you know, what's been called this kind of propulsive quality to the sentences, where they're really moving, and they're very packed. They're very, I mean, if you take just the first paragraph, which is not very long, but the second half of it is one sentence. So, you know, you're still dealing with trying to get all this stuff into every sentence. I mean, that's how I felt, that it was very, in that way, it was similar. I think there may be a little more dialogue and less dialect. Well, there is still the dialect issue, but it's not quite the same, because it's going the other direction in a sense. I mean, Giovanna, the narrator, is forbidden to use dialect, actually, as opposed to, you know, having to use it at home for Linu and Lila, or in fact for Lila, it becoming her only language, really. But so, you know, it's really, I think that it was more a sense of, I mean, it's very different, but sort of sentence by sentence, I think it was kind of a similar, to me, it seemed similar. I mean, my problems seemed similar.
I felt the same, and these long circuitous sentences, and I wondered how you were going to translate when the father and Giovanna are in the car and he's trying to justify his sins to her.
That's really quite a
1.5 pages, and you kept that. I was wondering if you were going to break it up for English.
You know, that's kind of a tour de force, I guess.
Yeah. Talk about this breathless, urgent, cascading prose, but you kept that, and it was very powerful. So I wanted to ask you about your experience then in translating first-person narratives in particular, and wondering if they make special demands on the translator. And what I mean is, does a first-person narration require an act of imaginative identification with the narrating character in order for the translator to fathom how that character would naturally express herself in English?
I think that especially with a first person narrator, but it kind of works also with a third person narrator, you're so much in the mind of the character that act is almost automatic. I think you become, at least I become I become that narrator. I mean, of course, with Ferrante, especially with the Neapolitan novels, it wasn't that hard for me, because, you know, I sort of am the same, more or less, let's say the same age. I lived that same period of the 20th century and the 21st century. So I sort of had this framework almost of the narrator. I mean, obviously, as I said before, you know, I didn't grow up in Naples, or in Rione of Naples, but I had some, there was some kind of contiguity or something. So, but generally I find that when I'm translating in the first person, I do just become that person in some sense. I mean, whether it's, you know, even like the Isla de Arturo. I mean, you become, I become Arturo. I'm certainly not Arturo, but it's just a kind of, I don't know, like a linguistic thing, like you're living in the words of that character. And so you do, in some sense, become that character.
And then as a corollary, though, what if the character is unsympathetic, an unsympathetic narrator?
Well,
how do you handle that? How do you become that or not?
you still, I think you still do. I mean, I think I still do. I mean, Giovanna is not a sympathetic character.
No.
But yet you still have, I mean, I guess I felt that I still, even if I didn't like what she was doing, I still had to be her in some way. And similarly, I guess, as you mentioned this, Lanu is also not always a sympathetic character. But you just, I think that you're so, especially, well, with something like the Neapolitan quartets, which, as you said, go on for such a long time, you know, you become used to having that personality, I guess, or that character, or knowing that they're going to, you know, make the wrong decision at this point in their life. And you're just with it. You're with it.
Yeah.
You know, it's in your mind.
Yeah. You're there. You don't have to overcome any kind of personal resistance to the character in order to stay in that. Right. Yeah.
Well, it's like the, you know, one of the sort of more famous metaphors for a translator is as an actor or a performer of some kind. So if you are in the role of the narrator, as you're the translator, narrator, actor, then it's part of who you are at that moment. Yeah.
Thank you so much. The final thing I wanted to mention, and I'm going to issue a spoiler alert to those of you who haven't read the book yet, and as I say, I encourage you to do so. You can turn off your sound, but just briefly, and you might have sort of been able to infer this from what we've been saying, the novel is narrated by a teenager, and her world falls apart when she finds out that both of her parents, whom she's really venerated, she finds out that each of them has been involved in long-term extramarital affairs. And at this point, her whole notion of adulthood, which is then foregrounded in the title, becomes very twisted. And she takes it on in a very self-destructive way. And her decision into adulthood then becomes an adulthood she understands in purely sexual terms. And so at the final, towards the end, she decides to lose her virginity in a completely loveless encounter. And so does her dear friend Ida at that point. So the last sentence in the translation is, quote, "On the train, we promised, that is Giovanna and Ida, promised each other to become adults as no one had ever been adult before," where she has understood adult to mean sexually initiated. So my question to Anne, to you, is, had you considered translating adulte in Italian as adult women with its gender-specific implications, or did you just want to leave it gender neutral?
I actually, this is a problem that I guess comes up in translation from Italian into English, because English doesn't have those convenient genders. You have to always add another word to something if you want to make it clear. I think that in that case, the truth is I don't think I thought it even occurred to me to translate it as adult women, but partly because I think that I assumed that you would feel that from the fact that she's referring to the two of them as the two women. The we is already women, and even in English you know that because of the way she's putting it. But it's something that does come up. I mean, I've had this experience of I forget what it. Oh, I think it was in Amore Molesto, Troubling Love, where there's no you don't know that the narrator. There's no way of knowing whether the narrator is in English, if the narrator is male or female. And so you have to, you suddenly, it's a kind of translator blind spot. And then you suddenly realize that you better make sure that that's known. So you have to stick in a word. You know, I forget what I did, we girls or something. But so it's a similar, you know, it's in some way it's a blind spot. In some way it's, in that case, I think that I assumed it was clear. And I probably, even if I'd considered it, I probably wouldn't have put it in because I would have said, oh, it's just too many words.
Yeah. 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 Well, yours scans much better, as I think is so often the case with your translations of Ferrante, and I'm not alone in thinking that.
Oh, thank you.
Yes. Well, thank you so much. This has been fantastic. And now it's time to give the audience its due. And I'm going to ask you, I hope you all know how to do the raise the hand feature on Zoom. And I'm sure, you know, you are going to have a lot to say and a lot to add to this conversation. So unfortunately, I can't see.
Serena.
Serena has her hand up.
Okay, great.
Hi, Anne. Thank you so much for this amazing interview. I'm a great admirer of your work. I'm very passionate, very interested in translation. And I have a bit of an industry question, I guess.
Oh, okay. Uh-huh.
Somewhat, vaguely. I was thinking, as a reader of translations, it seems to me, that there's an interest in the translator nowadays that I'm not sure was the case when you started off, because also what's fascinating about your career is the time span that it kind of went through. And I keep thinking about the changes that you must have seen in publishing and also in translation, in the idea that people have about translation, and with it, the idea that perhaps American readers have of foreign literatures. And I was thinking, if you could tell us anything about that. Like nowadays, people seem to, I mean, I'm sure I'm not trying to argue that translators are now kind of global stars or anything like that, but there does seem to be a visibility that wasn't there. So a lot of people would know of Mark Polizzotti, for example, and people associate Patrick Modiano's Nobel Prize victory also to the American translator that took some part in making. And in the same way as people think of Ferrante, people think of you as well.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking, when you translated Morante, and I think that was, or one of your earliest translations, how was your relationship to the reading public, and how has that changed? Do you feel like you're speaking more directly to a reading public, you're more well known, and what does that mean for your relationships to publishing as well, like publishers? And so in a sense, what does it mean professionally? How has the profession changed?
Well, I think that it's sort of thanks to Ferrante in a way, because the absent author made the translator visible, which was, of course, a great shock to me that when that started to be the case, that people would ask me, you know, would want me to be interviewed or something like that. But it turned out that people like to have a person associated with the book. And I thought it was a good thing to do because I wanted to promote the books, but I also thought it was a good thing for translators because it sort of reminds people, that there is a translator between you and the work that you're reading. So I think that was a big change. I mean, I don't mean that I brought that about single-handedly, but I just mean that it sort of gave a push to the idea of translation and of translators. And I think a lot of other people, a lot of other translators have now, sort of made a point of trying to be more visible. There's a lot more books are, well, I mean, I don't know about the percentage. I keep hearing that the percentage is still the same, but it seems to me that there are many more small presses that do translations. There are all these online magazines like Words Without Borders and Asymptote that are devoted to translation. So I think there is definitely a greater visibility to translations. On the other hand, the big publishing houses still don't do many translations. They don't promote them at all. So there's still a big gap between translated literature and, the public in a way. But it has changed, definitely. I mean, more, let's say, just from the point of view of more translators having their names on the cover of a book.
Thank you so much. And let's hear from another translator, Michael Moore.
Yeah, Michael.
Maybe it's not fair because Anne and I talk all the time, but I wanted to go back to an earlier question, which was about books that you are commissioned to do, but I believe that the Morante is a book that you proposed to the publisher, the Isola d'Arturo. Am I correct in remembering that? And if so, why did you propose the Morante?
I didn't really propose it. I mean, I proposed, I'm trying to remember exactly how it came about. I think what happened was, I think it was just a conversation with Bob Weil about Morante, and he thought it would be interesting to do Morante, and the rights to Arturo's Island became free, and that's why it was Arturo's Island.
Oh, okay.
And I was interested in Morante. I thought, well, she's a great writer. I wouldn't mind spending a little time with her.
Okay. And a devilishly difficult text too, huh?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I didn't, as always, you never know what you're getting into. Right, Michael?
I always start thinking, oh, this will be easy. And, maybe 25% of the way into it, I just start, tearing my hair out,
Yeah. But Michael just finished the Promessi Sposi, so I'm just saying.
Which is why I have so little hair, yeah.
Yes, I see that Juliet has her hand up. We don't see her face, but there she
Here
is.
I am. Hi. Thank you. And thank you all for your wonderful questions too. I was wondering, you mentioned that you like to stick close to the text, and I was just wondering how much outside reading you do when you're translating an author, whether you read history, whether you read other like contemporary authors. I mean, with Ferrante, it's different because she's so contemporary, but with the others, whether you're doing secondary readings as you're doing your translation or before, yeah.
Well, usually I don't have time because usually there's a deadline. So I don't really do a lot of outside reading, but of course I do use the internet, a million times a day. And you can do a lot of outside reading on the internet in a way that's really incredibly helpful. But I don't usually, there usually isn't time. I mean, the truth is most of the reading that I've done in Italian has been sort of, mid-20th century writers. So I have a pretty good idea or some idea of that. But yeah, I don't usually have time. One thing, I'll just mention one other thing, which is that often what I read, and especially if I'm going to Italy, which I hope to do eventually, is I often will read like an English novel in order to have the sound of good English. And I mean, some like Henry James or something, of being sure to have good English in my head too.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions?
Sorry again to barge in, but I had a question about the last novel in the quartet, because I've seen some changes from the Italian in the English, and I'm not sure if that's because maybe you've worked on a previous draft of the Italian manuscript.
Especially of the last one, it's possible.
Mm.
Okay.
But I don't know. If you would like to send them to me, I could find out. I could figure it out.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, that would be great. Yes.
Yeah, I'd be curious myself.
And ask.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Sarah.
Are you calling on me or somebody else?
Oh, you go ahead if you're ready.
Oh, sorry, I didn't hear. I have a quick question. You mentioned that you translated Jhumpa Lahiri.
Oh, yes.
And I'm curious about the book she wrote in her first attempt to write in Italian, and then her translation into English. Are you familiar with those?
The first one, the one about learning Italian?
Yes,
That's
yeah.
the one I translated, yeah.
You did the translate. That's what I was
Yes.
curious.
Yes, but after that, since then, she's been translating herself.
That's what I was wondering. Okay, thank you.
Uh-huh.
Sarah?
I am so curious about your process when you get something new to translate. Do you read everything first, or do you just sit down and start translating as you're reading?
It depends on the timing. You know, if I have time, I think ultimately it's probably better to read it, because you know you sort of know what you have. But I don't always. I mean, then there is that, idea of the real-time translation too, but I don't know, it depends.
Are there any other?
Brandy, it looks like, and then Michael again.
I'm not seeing hands.
Hi, this is me.
Oh,
Hi.
great.
My question is, I guess, turning back to Primo Levi for a minute.
Mhm.
The idea of translating the whole works. Are there special challenges when you are dealing with an author who perhaps is developing a style or a style that's changing? On the one hand, you've read all of his works, so you're at the end of it, but you want to reflect in your translation development and the changes through stages. I guess I was thinking about that in relation to knowing later a word like when you were talking about
Guatemala.
yeah, or smacchinatore, you already know that that's going to become something. I'm just curious, how do you allow for, sorry about that, for the less mature voice of an author to come out having read everything?
I don't know how to really answer that. I think, again, there's a lot of unconscious stuff that goes on when you're translating that you don't even realize. When I try to analyze I
guess also as an editor, I mean, you had to look at the complete works of Primo Levi.
I think that in a way, having different translators probably was helpful for that. Because each translator was dealing only with his or her own text or own texts, and therefore was emphasizing bringing out the style at that point. And I wasn't rewriting the translations at all. So I was trying to keep them, as I said, in some way consistent, but also keeping each one in its own voice. So I guess that's really what I would say.
I think that's what I was curious about, that very fine line that you walk between consistency and stylistic homogeneity.
Right.
It's tricky, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Fascinating to me.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like, I guess I was saying this to somebody the other day, that it's, if, you could read someone's translation, you could say, well, I certainly wouldn't do it that way. But then you figure out like why or how that other translator came to that, and it makes sense. And so you don't rewrite it in your own way.
I have a question if no one else does at this point. I was interested in how many of Ferrante's novels have been adapted for the screen. When I think about L'amore molesto, I giorni dell'abbandono, of course the quartet, and then apparently there's a plan to also film The Lying Life.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you have thoughts about what makes her text very screen-worthy.
I don't know. I mean, I guess the Neapolitan novels do seem kind of, well, they've been, the versions of them that have been made are very book-worthy in a funny way. I mean, they do stay close to the book, so I guess you could say that the books are somehow filmable. I don't really think in those terms. I'm not a very filmically minded person, but I guess they are quite vivid, and a lot of, there's a lot of events. So sometimes even, I mean, I remember thinking that actually in the first first episode of the first one of My Brilliant Friend, there's almost too much that happens. You know, it's almost too, there's so many things that happen, but that have to be in that in order for the rest to make sense. But it's kind of too eventful. Whereas in the books, although there are those many events, you don't feel like there are too many events.
I think because we have more control over our reading process.
Well, that too. Yeah, I guess that's true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I was wondering if it had to do with the very reason that the Italian critical establishment finds her not literary, because the focus is not on il bello stile at the aesthetic narrative or literary level, but it's about action and character and a kind of coinvolgimento, you know, at the level of substance, actually. And you're right. I mean, as you said, that her prose is very vivid and very urgent, and very engaging. And that is what we want when we adapt a text to the film, to the screen.
To the screen, yeah. Yeah, no, it's true. Yeah.
What do you think of the HBO series of the quartet?
Well, I liked it because I thought it was very close to the books.
Exactly. As you said, very bookish. Yes. Yes. But also, you know, very, very cinematic at the same time.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. I see Michael's hand up again.
Yeah, I was struggling to find the raise your hand function. You know, it's sort of buried in there. William Weaver used to say that he would never look at his translations once they were published, because, you know, toward the end you're in this cycle of revising again and again and again, and always on the first page you'll find some word that you're dissatisfied with. And I'm wondering if you share that feeling.
Totally. I really hate looking at my translations, because I really do always see, you know, things that could be improved.
How do you know when to let go? That's such a great question. Deadline? There's
a deadline, usually. But I always say to myself, well, okay, I'm going to hand it in, but I can read the galleys.
You know, I've had the experience where, like, one translation, which was in the first person, like one of my sisters said, "This sounds like you." And I was sort of puzzled of whether that was a good or a bad thing, but it was first person colloquial, so I guess it sounded natural. But I've looked at other translations I've done, and they don't, like Levy, and it doesn't sound at all like me, and I think that that's a good thing. I mean,
yeah.
Do we have any other questions? Well, to use Sarah's phrase, maybe it is time for us to let go. It's been a wonderful, wonderful hour and a half with you, Anne. You've been so generous, and it's been so enlightening on so many levels.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me and being so hospitable.
Yeah, well, it's been an absolute privilege for us, you know, beyond words. We can't translate them either into any language, but thank you so much, Anne. And we hope that once this pandemic is over, that we can actually have you here in person and really be hospitable in the way we want to be always at Yale to our wonderful honored guests. So thank you so much. And I want to thank everyone here, and especially Costanza and Giovanni and Sarah, and all of you, and of course Simona for this great idea, Jane for supporting this entire enterprise. And again, I hope you'll all be safe and be well and keep cheerful. This nightmare will be over, and we will be able to be together again.
Sorry, can I just say something? Also, our last interview within these events will be on Ferrante. It will be a book by Jill Richards and others called the Ferrante Letters, which is like, you know, it's not really like an academic book, and it's very interesting.
Oh, it's very interesting, that book.
Yeah, it hinges on a book club. And so these girls have started, you know, just writing letters to each other about reading Ferrante. So I don't know if you would be interested in coming at all, just feel free. you're welcome to join us. And everyone, of course. Thank you.
Yes. Well, you can all unmute and give Anne a warm round of applause.
Thanks so much. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Ciao.
Ciao.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Arrivederci. Bye. Thank you.
Ciao.
Thank you.
Thank you.
As people go away, I do have a quick question that I wasn't sure could be public, but are you working on anything now that you can tell us about?
Oh, yes. I actually just finished a book by a really interesting writer who I had never heard of, named Marina Yare, who is, she died a few years ago, but she's half, her father was Latvian and her mother was a Waldensian. So she's quite an interesting character. So that book's coming out in June. Yeah, it's pretty interesting.
What kind of a book? Is it a novel?
It's an autobiography. It's an autobiography. But she was a novelist. I mean, I hadn't heard of her until the publisher came to me and said, "Would you be interested in this?" And she seemed really interesting. So
Wow.
I recommend that.
Cool. Thank you.
Did she grow up in Italy?
She grew up in Riga for the first 10 years of her life, and then her parents divorced, and she moved to Italy. And so she lived the rest of her life in Turin, basically. Well, outside Turin, in the Waldensian valleys of Piemonte, and then in Turin.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
I'll have to look for. What's the title?
it's called Distant Fathers.
Distant Fathers. We'll have to look for it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
That is interesting.
Thank you so much.
Oh,
Sorry,
thank you for having me. Thank you all three of you guys for your questions. That was great.
This has just been a joy.
I'm sorry, can I just ask one very last question? Because I'm just so curious. I would have like 1,000 questions. So that would be on Jhumpa Lahiri and Amara Lacus, because, you know, I'm so interested in your work and as translating them, because they are themselves translators and they know many languages themselves.
Yeah,
So
I know.
how is that process working for you?
Well, Jhumpa, that was really just a one-time thing. I think she realized afterwards that she was better off translating herself. I don't mean that she didn't like the translation. I just think she realized that she was scared to translate herself. She's not scared, but she didn't want to, you know, she just thought it would be weird.
In fact, I know that, yeah, she just translated herself with the Dove mi trovo.
Yes,
into
exactly.
English. Yeah.
Yeah, that's coming out in April, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so she decided that she was going to translate herself. With Amara Lacus, he is also, I think, writing in English now, maybe. But yeah, I mean, he was much more. He was a very straightforward writer in Italian. Yeah. Yeah.
His texts are great for like intermediate advanced Italian language learners.
Oh, yes, they're wonderful. Right. Yeah.
For that reason, they're straightforward.
Yeah. No, I miss him.
What's his name?
Amara Lacus. Algerian.
Yeah. Does he live in New York now?
He lives in New York. Well, yes, except he's been stuck in Michigan for the pandemic. His wife is from Michigan, and it just was easier for them to be there, I think. Yeah.
Well, maybe we could all meet in Italy this summer. What do you think?
Do you think we'll be able to go this summer?
That's the question.
Yeah.
That's the question.
That's the question. Yeah, I know, exactly.
Yeah. Let's hope. Wouldn't that be a dream come true if we could? Yeah, do that. Okay, again.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Yes,
Thank you very much.
so much.
Thank you.
Yes.
I'm leaving you now.
Yes.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Yes. Ciao.